Recorded live outside the Fantasmo Lounge deep in the woods of Luray, Virginia. It's Fantasmo After Dark with your host, Rob Floyd, and special guest co-host, Professor Sam Batman and Commodore Tony Mercer.
Ahoy!
Hello, good evening.
Well, hey guys, and hey everybody else. Welcome back to the old podcast here. Tonight's topic is going to be interesting and fun. We're going to try to talk about when the setting for horror movies went from natural creepy settings like Gothic castles and creepy mansions to peaceful pastoral settings such as your neighborhood or a farm or an old country road, places that typically were not creepy, but now whenever you go to any place like that, that's all you can think of is how creepy it is. So we'll see what we can do here. And that's the story of that story. So we were talking about this the other night, guys.
Yes.
And what did we talk about? Do you remember?
I don't know, but I like the way you said Luray.
Luray.
Devil went down to Luray looking for a soul to steal.
Let me clarify that. We are not in the Fantasmo Lounge this week. We are on location in a lonely old cabin deep in the woods of Luray, Virginia.
Near the banks of the mighty Shenandoah.
Yeah. Taking a little vacation and relaxing, and we thought, well, we got the three of us here. We're going to talk anyway. We might as well record it. So we did some pre-gaming last night, what we were going to talk about. And we hope we can remember what we talked about last night so we can elaborate on it tonight.
Well, as I recall, we at some point we were talking about the gradual shift, right, away from your traditionally spooky locales, right?
Yeah.
A castle is creepy. An old dark house traditionally was creepy.
Yeah, it's another character in the film almost.
But at some point, you stop having the creepy, haunted, deserted house in your neighborhood to just a regular old house in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And yet there's still a monster inside it.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's not, you wouldn't expect it to be there. Whereas in the old dark house or the creepy castle, the Gothic castle, you would expect something there to be creepy. But, the house in your neighborhood or, the farm down at the end of the road, you're not expecting it to be creepy until a certain point in filmmaking.
There's almost a topic in itself where you're saying, well, of course you would expect the Gothic castle to be creepy. You wouldn't expect the pastoral fields to be creepy. And I know exactly what you mean, but there's almost a topic in itself to ask the question, why would you expect the Gothic castle to be creepy? Right?
Well,
that's a convention that came from somewhere, and we understand that convention and what it means. And is the creepiness inherent to the setting, or is it drawn from the convention? Right? So these are conventions that were established in American horror films in the earliest days of the horror film.
Yeah.
That's what horror films were rooted in. And then eventually you have European imports that are trading in the same sort of imagery. But the question is, would the European horror films have traded in that imagery had they not had the American films to draw from as an influence? Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that one way or the other.
We're going to find out tonight.
Yeah.
Well, it's an excellent question. What makes a large, imposing European castle scary and a large, imposing American skyscraper mundane?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, because there's no vampires in the skyscraper, but there isn't in a big old castle.
Or so you've been led to believe, right? And I pointed out earlier, you guys, correct me if I'm veering too far too fast, but right, you drive up when Janet Leigh drives up to the Bates Motel.
Yeah.
There's nothing scary about the Bates Motel until the camera pulls back and you see the creepy old house up on the hill behind it.
Yeah.
But until the very end of the movie, spoiler for people who've never seen Psycho, shame on you. All the bad stuff happens in the motel, not in the creepy old house at the top of the hill.
Yeah.
Right?
So it switches the convention. And from then on, after that, for everybody who's seen the movie, whenever you're driving, going on a road trip, and you see rundown or an older motel on the side of the road, you look over and you think, or you say, oh, Bates Motel.
By itself in an out-of-the-way locale, not nestled safely inside a town, but just on the outskirts.
And there may be nothing inherently creepy about the look of the motel, but it's ingrained in your head because of Psycho. And I think that's what it is with these farm settings or neighborhoods, is because certain movies came out. It's at a certain time, like Chainsaw's the first one that comes to anybody's mind, I think, for a farm type horror or old country road thing. After that came out, or maybe sometime before that was another film we talked about. From then on, it's a creepy setting, and you have that image in your head. But until then, it wasn't.
Well,
Night
of the Living Dead begins in a cemetery.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stay in the cemetery. It goes to the isolated farmhouse.
Yeah.
Which until then would have been a completely innocuous locale. And then all the action takes place in and around that farmhouse. And now, again, you see a farmhouse standing in a field by itself. You're going, I don't know that place looks defensible against zombies. Too many open windows.
Yeah. Whereas before, you'd be going, oh, man, that's like what my grandparents lived in. That was a nice place.
That's a nice piece of property right there.
I tell you what. Now, I don't know. I don't know if you wanted to analyze why it is that the Bates house, not the Bates Motel, but the Bates house or the creepy castle, has an inherent creepiness to it. I mean, you could say, oh, well, there's a sense of decay and an age, a sense of history's unknown, right? Like you don't know what could possibly have transpired in this thing over the course of its existence over time. And the weight of that could contribute to it being scary. If you're talking about a castle and you're talking about a Gothic horror, then you're talking about just the very idea that something like a vampire or a werewolf or a witch is very much an old world concern. And an old world setting sort of anchors that old world concern into our world now. So that's the sort of armchair analysis you could do if you were trying to figure out why those settings would be inherently creepy in and of themselves, as opposed to just established conventions in a horror film.
Yeah.
That's what makes them creepy. But I'm just spitballing here, and all of that could be
that's all we're doing.
All of that could be complete crap, right? It might not actually be true, but you can apply the exact same thing to the farmhouse setting, the pastoral setting, the isolated house in the middle of the field, right? Is there something about that setting in and of itself that triggers some kind of primal instinctual fear or loneliness or sense of vulnerability? Or again, is it just these are conventions that have been established in horror films over time? I suspect the truth is probably somewhere in the middle for all that stuff.
Well, there's mileage there in the sense that, old things imply decay, right? You don't have anything here in the United States more than 400 years old, right? Jamestown, 1607, Plymouth Rock, 1620. You don't really get America going for another, 150 years, right? America. Yeah. So you've got nothing old established here the way you do in Europe, where they've got more than a century or more than a millennium on you, right? This castle is 800, 1200, 1500, 2000 years old, right? There's plenty of time for creepiness to take root there. You don't have anything old here. And then when you do have something old, it's still not that old. Your oldest settlements are going to be in Virginia and in New England, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to transition away from that perspective of creepiness and evil and decay and a monster to just the isolation and the abandonment, I guess, and start to think that, could you have a haunting in a brand new subdivision, or could you have a haunting like they did in Poltergeist? Yeah. Or could you have a haunting in a trailer park or a brand new high rise? And so we've had to fall back even further on the notion of, well, yes, if it's built over an old Native American graveyard, but otherwise probably not.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. So the old dilapidated farmhouse in this sense is simply the closest analog that we would have here,
right,
to the ancient castle in Europe. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, well, touching on that, the feeling of isolation, that this is kind of a whole separate topic, but we never go on tangents here. That's kind of I don't know if a primal fear, but probably one of your first fears as a child, being abandoned or being left alone, your parents leaving you alone, or going away, or thinking that you could be left alone. I know I've had nightmares like that over the years, ever since I was a kid. And it is primal because pets are the same way. You have a dog or a cat, and you go outside for 5 minutes, you come back. 5 minutes, you come back. They're like, "Oh God, you're back! You're back! I thought you were never going to." Your dog jumps all over you.
Yeah.
Sure.
So that's kind of playing on almost a universal primal fear.
Well, and it's if we're going down the track that I think we're going down tonight in the movies we're going to talk about, right? You do address that in the sense that civilization has power, society has power, and the isolation comes when you are removed from that society.
Yeah.
Therefore, whether it's Hansel and Gretel being out in the woods and finding the witch's gingerbread house, or it's Little Red Riding Hood going out in the woods to deliver the basket of goodies to her grandmother, or the road trip gone awry that leads us into so many of the situations that we're going to get to, right? It's all taking place away from the core of society, the core of civilization in the city. You know, you go from the city to the suburbs to the rural area, and then you're out there in the middle of nowhere, and there's that isolated farmhouse or that lonely motel or that barn or whatever it is. Something or different rules apply out here in the territories, right?
Yeah.
Away from civilization.
Well, you know, and to backtrack a little bit too on that, some of those settings that you mentioned and talking about the movies we talked about the other day. We were talking too about like when did this start in film?
Mm-hmm.
Because up through more the 30s and the 40s was more the Gothic era stuff. The 50s was the atomic era, and that's a whole separate topic. That's a whole different type of film altogether. But the 60s, even the 60s through the 70s, Hammer was still making Gothic horror pictures.
Sure.
But I think we touched on it. It seems like it started, you could argue Night of the Living Dead, the late 60s.
Yeah, 68.
But I think it really kind of took hold, what do we say, in the early 70s with Chainsaw was one of the first ones, but that was 74.
Right.
What else? What was the other thing
we backtracked to Last House on the Left, which I think is 72?
Yeah.
72. Which has action that takes place in the big city.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but all the real horror occurs away from the city and as you return to the country.
Yeah, on a lonely country road, and then the woods right behind the girl's house, which is supposed to be her safest place.
Right.
You know, so then that makes even the area surrounding your yard and your house creepy, you know?
Yeah.
And that's very much a don't talk to strangers, don't accept rides from strangers kind of setup too.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could even argue, I mean, you know, I Spit on Your Grave the same way.
Mm-hmm.
That it's the girl's going like what we're doing now, going on vacation. And, you know, she rented this house. There's a nice lake there. It's all calm. There's a quaint little town. And then this horror happens to her there. And after that, you know, would you look at that same setting the same way again? If you've never been exposed to that, probably so. But those of us that watch a lot of horror movies, you know.
Yeah.
Well, let me backtrack you a bit because we did mention Psycho, right, which is 1960.
Uh-huh.
And Hitchcock's, correct me if I'm wrong, Hitchcock's next big picture, is it 63, The Birds, or did you do something in the interim? Because The Birds...
Over to you, Commodore.
You got me on that one.
Well, I ask because, you know, The Birds is a fairly pastoral setting, right? Small village, right? But the action did start in the big city in San Francisco.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then it transitions to this smaller coastal town.
Yeah.
And then the horror comes from outside with animals run amok. And so The Birds really counts more as a thriller than an outright horror movie. But still, it's not a castle. It's not anything old world, right? And so you're seeing this slow and subtle transition into more and more innocuous pedestrian Americana settings, right?
Outside of school and a gas station and somebody's
restaurant.
A restaurant. Just these average, normal places you go every day.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's become a scene of terror and horror.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, you really start to get into that in the 70s, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's what we were talking about. It just came back to me. Was that a conscious choice to do that, to change the setting, to make this setting creepy, or was it necessity of budget? We can't afford a big set. We can't afford to build a big set, so we're going to go on location. Well, what location can we get for free to use? Hey, there's that old farmhouse that my cousin's uncle owns that he said we could use. You know, okay, what's our story now? You know, we have our location.
Mm-hmm.
I'm leaning more towards that was pretty much the reason for most of these, because they came out of pretty much the grindhouse era, the drive-in era. I think when most of this type of thing shifted, because they were having to make, you know, they were all mostly independent pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And made very quick so they could get them out and start making some money.
Yeah, I think you can make a very strong argument that it's done for budgetary reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But also I think there may have been this undercurrent of social thought, not conscious social thought, but just an unconscious social thought. Why would ordinary circumstances reveal a monster, right? And what had happened in the previous decade or two to show us that there are creepy things right next door where you least expect them.
Oh yeah.
Whether it is the Starkweather murder rampage in the mid-50s, or Ed Gein in the late 50s, or flash forward another decade to the Manson murders, which unnerved the entire nation, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then suddenly nobody is safe at home. And not so much the murders themselves, but the revelation that Manson's family used to do those creepy crawls, where they would slip into houses while people were asleep and rearrange furniture.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because they could.
Yeah.
And, you wake up and things have been moved and things have changed and you're terrified. And it's not because you have a poltergeist. It's because you don't keep your windows locked.
Yeah, which is a terrifying thought.
Sure.
So according to the Oracle, The Birds was Hitchcock's next picture after Psycho chronologically.
Okay.
But inquiring minds want to know.
They do.
They look this stuff up.
We don't leave people hanging.
No. Well, yeah. So I tend to think that the transition to pastoral settings in broad daylight for horror films has a lot to do with the dissolution of the studio system and the rise of the independents as you transition out of the 60s and into the 70s. Things just in the studio era tended to be shot on sound stages and backlots.
Yeah.
Now that you have independent producers generating most of the genre content in the early to mid 70s, it's about where can you shoot cheaply and without a lot of hassle and probably without a license.
Yeah.
Using natural light and all that sort of thing. So I tend to think that more than anything was probably the driving force there. I struggle with the idea that someone engineered it, right, as a thoughtful aesthetic choice and said, you know what would be really scary is if we went out to the middle of this field or that creepy ass farmhouse. I think it was a function of necessity, but at the same time, I think it's impossible to deny, to Sam's point, the influence that the post-Summer of Love hippie hangover and the Manson family and do you know who your kids are and what the hell they're up to period had on that. And it's tempting to draw a line between the two things. And there may very well be a connection between the two things because when you think of one, you tend to think of the other, right? The killer hippie and the or hippie biker or whatever the case may be in the pastoral setting.
And that brings us to a couple of other movies. Talking about the killer biker and the killer hippie, werewolves on wheels, holding on to that gothic supernatural monster, but bringing it into this normal regular setting, and trying to shift it. And even with vampire movies in the 70s like that, the Yorga movies, he was a classic vampire, but it was in modern day. They still had him living in a big mansion. It wasn't quite a castle, so they were trying to keep that creepy element, but it was somebody's house they could use the location for is what it was in Hollywood or LA or somewhere. But you go to Blackula, and he just had his coffin stashed, it was in a underground in a plant, some kind of electrical plant or...
So you're talking like a factory or warehouse, something like that. Warehouse. Some industrial setting.
Yeah, something like that is where he didn't have it, didn't have a mansion or a Gothic castle or anything like that. So it's the same thing as what kind of location can we get? Okay, now we've got to make our creepy story around it.
Right. It's not there's anything inherently creepy about the warehouse district, but what if one of these homeless guys hanging around the warehouse district is actually X?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you cannot make a plausible storyline of vampire, werewolf, alien, whatever your classic monster might have been, and then you go to, well, it's just some psycho killer, right? For unexplained reasons, why do they do what they do?
Yeah, and the majority of them, I think, were more like that, a psycho killer type thing. There's just these few instances, just off the top of my head. I'm sure there were more, though. But with the werewolf and the vampire, I can't think of a Frankenstein-like version that they did that with around that time, except for Blackenstein, but we won't talk about that right now. Less said about that one, the better. Nothing comes to mind.
Nothing springs to mind, no.
I mean, there were some zombie pictures, but mostly it was like psycho killers or slasher type.
Or just, like Tony said, you don't know who your kids are, and you don't know who your kids are with or what they're up to.
Oh, yeah.
And
when there was a big rush of the satanic films, too, which is kind of that theme a little bit in there. And Race with the Devil's a great one. Another one, people on vacation in a motorhome. They come across something out in the woods that they shouldn't have seen, and now these Satanists are after them and chasing them across country. And they were just out to have a vacation, man. And, it shouldn't be a horror scene. It shouldn't be a scary place. They're parked by a lake. But now, if you go anywhere like that and you've seen that movie, then you're thinking that, you're thinking it's creepy where I'm at now, when there's nothing inherently creepy really about it.
If you're not chased by Satanists, you're chased by mutants, right? In the hills have eyes, right? The lesson here is don't leave home.
I think when you listen to some of those key players in horror in that period, say a Wes Craven or something like that, they'll inevitably talk about some of the news footage that was coming back from Vietnam and, the horrific imagery that Americans were being exposed to at that time. And, if you're going to make a horror picture when everyone has seen that, what are you going to show them to scare them? When everyone has seen that, then the vampire in his castle maybe isn't going to faze them. And you need to present it in a more familiar context in order to make it real enough to affect folks. But I suspect that there's some level of artists thinking about what they may have been thinking about when they did the things they did when they were young, once they're older. And that being essentially sort of a revisionist take on, why did we do that? Because the question remains for me, if you had taken whatever idea that you had for a horror film, be it Last House on the Left or whatever, and made it at Warner's or MGM on sound stages, what would that have been like? Would you have been on those sound stages saying, no, everyone's already seen that Vietnam footage, so we need to make sure that this is has a documentary feel to it, and that's what we need to create on these here big budget sound stages. I don't buy it. I think there was a time when I would have bought that. But I think that time for me is over, and again, the truth must be in the middle. So was that stuff on some level an influence, even subconsciously, on the choices that were being made by these creators at that time? Sure. Let's take them at their word. But I think the conditions under which those movies were made informed a lot of those choices more than anything. And they may very well have been different choices altogether had those conditions been different. And I think the later work of some of these very same folks sort of bears that out.
Well, and then there's we need to kind of, I think, figure out or talk about, which I don't know if we started, it was Psycho and Night of the Living Dead, the beginning of this, where the shift was, because after that, there were a lot of movies made utilizing the same type of themes, the same type of settings, and were they done for the same reason, budget? Were they done because, this one made on a farm was scary and they made some money, let's us make one on a farm with a killer that, and maybe we'll make some money too.
I mean,
I'm sure that was kind of the mindset, because everything imitates something that was successful, especially in horror movies and sci-fi movies and such. What was that other one you were talking about? The one, the barn?
Oh, Barn of the Naked Dead.
Barn of the Naked Dead. Great title.
Yes.
Lovely title.
And it's released under more than one title, but that's how I found it, was Barn of the Naked Dead. And it's clearly one of those, something else made money, let's do this. Because it's showgirls bound for Las Vegas break down driving across the desert and end up tied up in a barn with some other women who are selectively either being chosen to mate with the killer or be hunted by the killer, a la the Most Dangerous Game, or they're going to end up as stew. I don't think there's any cannibalism in it, but I will leave that on the table. But that was influenced clearly by other movies.
Yeah. Now, when did this one come
74.
out? 74.
Same year as Texas
Chainsaw. What about 3 on a Meat Hook? Do you remember when that came out?
I want to say that's either 73 or 75.
Oh, okay. So
but it's clearly mid-70s.
Yeah. Okay. So there were a lot of these around the same time.
Yeah, because 3 on a Meat Hook is the guy goes cruising single bars to pick up women and then takes them back to his house and has them hanging up in the barn.
But that one, didn't their car break down or something? The first
probably,
3 that we
probably.
see?
Again,
so
don't leave home.
Like that barn movie.
Yes.
Same type of thing.
Don't accept help from strangers. Also, it begins the trope of outsiders clearly messing where they're not invited and don't belong.
Yeah.
Don't poke fun at the locals because they're going to come back and get you. And you see that most clearly with the hitchhiker in Texas Chainsaw.
Yeah.
Who turns out to be Leatherface's brother.
Yeah. Now, Chainsaw, we just showed that back in October at the Narrow. Hadn't seen that in a long time. And still just as effective as it was the first time I saw it. In fact, Tony and I we drove up to the Bird, remember that?
Yeah.
A few years ago and saw it as a late show at the Bird in an ice storm. I think it was ice all over the place that night. The place was packed.
Mm-hmm.
So, these settings and these movies do reach people on a level that I guess the familiarity they can relate to, other than I love a good Gothic horror movie. God knows I do. But I can't really draw from any experience of being in that setting to feel it on a certain level.
Well,
the creepiness of it. I've been to a farm before.
Mm-hmm. Well, think about this. I mean, starting with, say, Last House on the Left, are we there seeing the beginning of the young protagonist trope? Uh-huh. Because at what point did the heroes in horror movies stop being middle-aged men?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Okay, well,
because Cushing, who's a standby for Hammer, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
If he's not playing Frankenstein, then he's playing Van Helsing.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
But he's an older fellow.
Yeah.
Right? Your protagonists for the Universal films are older people, right? Established people. And this is a trope that carries up through the 60s, where we'd have settled, older, rational, reasonable, middle-aged establishment type protagonists. And then you reach a period where suddenly all the protagonists or victims are young people, right? They're not teenagers.
Yeah.
But they are in their 20s, right?
Yeah.
Or just around that 19 to 21 mark, because this is
between teenagers and young adults.
Because these are the people that you get in Last House and Texas Chainsaw and Black Christmas and Three on a Meat Hook,
exactly,
and so on and so forth, right? Suddenly they're the targets. They're either going to survive or they're not. But you have a whole generational slide there coming into the 70s.
I think the transition is a little more gradual than some of the other things that we're talking about, because I think once you get to the mid 60s and on, you're looking at an emphasis on young folks, often a young couple, as effectively the protagonists of the story.
Okay.
With Peter Cushing or Peter Cushing et al. As essentially the Obi-Wan Kenobi in the story. This is so you begin. So if you go all the way back, for example, to the first Hammer Dracula, where you have Harker taken out in the first act, and then Van Helsing sort of replace him as the protagonist. He is the protagonist indeed. And then once you get again into the mid 60s and beyond, Cushing or his, I hesitate to say equivalent, because did he have an equivalent? But for sake of
probably not.
Never has and never
for the sake
will.
of discussion, his equivalent is functioning as the sage advisor, the Merlin or Obi-Wan Kenobi to the young protagonist, but it's, but it's the younger guy and his love interests that are ostensibly the focus and protagonists of the picture. And then eventually you reach a point where the sage advisor figure is gone altogether and the kids are left on their own.
Yeah, and you see that working through Rosemary's Baby, where the sage advisor just happens to be working for Satan. And so does the husband and the young couple. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something I said the other night just came back to me, but talking about the pastoral settings not being creepy, but being made to be creepy after what you've seen, but making you see that. The best example of it ever to me is the intro from Tales from the Dark Side, where they're showing these, the covered bridge, this country road, this meadow, nothing creepy about it. It's in the daylight. It's pretty. It looks peaceful and relaxing, but then that voiceover comes in, that monotone voiceover, and then music. And I think it goes to a negative image or something right towards the end. But that voiceover and that music changes the whole feeling of those images. that covered bridge becomes creepy and you don't want to go on it. That meadow, it's like something bad is happening there and you don't want to know about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting example because because that Tales from the Dark Side intro was in fact quite creepy when I was a kid, and I don't think I was sitting there going, because I have seen Last House on the Left or any number of, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or any number of pictures, I associate these images with creepiness.
Yeah.
Certainly wasn't the case when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I think it's just it's something about those lonely, isolated settings that activate something in the mind.
Yeah.
That it only needs a little nudge over the edge to become scary.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
And that nudge is the music and the voiceover. Because if you watch it, if you turn the sound off and you watch the intro, you'd be just, it's pretty, but that's it.
Yeah.
And then you turn that sound up and that chilling music and that voiceover, and then it clicks.
Yeah.
That isolation, you feel it then. And what's in that covered bridge I can't see.
Yeah.
Or, what's outside the frame of this picture, this meadow that's going to come up behind me while I'm sitting there enjoying the sunshine, Right.
The dark side is always there, waiting for us to enter, waiting to enter us, which, brings me to the question, were those kinds of settings always going to be as effective as they were? And it just took the film industry that long to tap that resource?
Yeah.
Or was there something that shifted in the period where that setting became prominent in horror that amplified or emphasized or established the creepiness of it? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think, again, you can, maybe I'm going too highbrow on you here.
That's why you're here.
Well, okay, think about this, right? Before the 1900s, your big killers in America, Wild West, right?
Okay.
Wild, untamed West. You venture west of the Mississippi River, and there's Billy the Kid, there's Wild Bill Hickok, and any number of gunslingers in the Old West, right? But as long as you stayed back east, you're probably okay. You get to the 1920s, Prohibition, right? It's gangsters, right? Capone, right? So the mob is who you got to be afraid of. Moving to the 30s, and it's bank robbers, right? It's Bonnie and Clyde, and it's Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and so on and so forth. But then you skip through the war years, and after the war years, like I said, there's Starkweather, right, in Nebraska. What is he, 16, 17 years old? Goes on a killing spree, shoots his girlfriend's parents. And then 10 or 12 other people before they finally catch him, send him to the electric chair. Then there's Crazy Ed Gein up in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Well, and then there's Manson. And everybody knows Manson. I'm sure I'm glossing over the Hillside Strangler or
Time of the Dread Sundown.
Yeah, a number of other incidents in our collective history. Yeah. But by the time you move into the 70s, and on top of this, you have the growing influence of television, which means you have a growing sense of social isolation even in regular communities because people are staying in to watch TV because there's more on TV. And you have less of a sense of actual community. So you don't know who your neighbors are. You don't know what's going on behind those closed doors or behind those window shades. Who are the people that you entrust your children to, right? Who are the people that are living next door to you? Yeah. And during this time, you have things like Ted Bundy, right, whose killing spree began in the early 70s. In the mid-70s, you've got not only Gacy, the friendly clown, but you've got the son of Sam, Berkowitz in New York, right? And I just lost the other one, but because Dahmer is much, much later. But in general, you have more and more of this unsettling. We never expected that. He was quiet. He was such a nice young man, right? Who do you know who your daughter's going out with? Who do you know who your son's going out with? Who do you know what your kids' teachers do? I mean, what are they up to on Saturdays and Sundays, and what's in so-and-so's basement? And you don't know. Right? So there's growing unease and mistrust. And I'm not saying that the filmmakers were consciously tapping into that, of course, so much as they're just looking to make a quick buck. But again, we don't have a great traditional setting. All we've got is this regular, ordinary town with a few selected places we can film on location. How do we make that scary? Well, let's just think about who could be living there. What could be living there? Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a werewolf. It just has to be something hiding behind a mask. Yeah. And that mask is your friendly neighborhood postman, or the Sunday school teacher, or whatever. The guy, the plumber who comes to fix your pipes.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing with Ed Gein. You know, he was just quirky old Ed who did babysit some of the kids in the town and did odd jobs for people, you know. And you never would have thought that, this quiet, you know, kind of maybe even socially awkward, not retarded, but mildly off guy lived on the old family farm. Oh, no, not Ed, you know. Not up there on that family farm. That family's been there for years. And then somebody shows up one day, and they open the barn, and there's a headless body hanging, female body hanging by its feet, gutted and field dressed. You know, and they go in the house, and there's this horrific scene of bone furniture and skin lampshades and
a belt made out of nipples.
Yeah, and something on the stove and in the fridge and all this stuff, and innocence lost.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
And from and then the farm is scary. You know, this peaceful, serene setting is no longer. It took a while because that was Ed Gein. That happened in the 50s? 58. So it kind of took a while for film to catch up to use that type of thing. And I'm sure there were a couple in the 60s that we're just spacing out on.
Well,
maybe,
Psycho is the most direct descendant of the Gein case.
Yeah.
Not everybody realizes that the alternate derivative of the Gein case is Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, once you know, it's obvious with the bone furniture and the lampshade from skin and the cannibalism and so on.
Took it to a more fantastical
But
element.
that film focuses on what they found inside the farmhouse, whereas Psycho focuses on the fact that, Ed sometimes dressed up as his mother.
Yeah.
Or had that kind of psychological break in his upbringing, right? So it's two sides of the coin.
Now, did you see Deranged? Have you seen that?
No, but I'm vaguely familiar with it.
I think we actually did a podcast on that a couple years ago. That's a marriage between the two.
Mm-hmm.
It's closer to, I think, the actual Ed Gein story from what I've read over the years, in so far as the amount, the number of people he actually did kill, which really wasn't that many.
No,
he was more of a ghoul. He dug up graves and stuff, and what he did and everything that kind of plays out, and it's an interesting little film, independent, low budget film, but it starts off kind of like a documentary, and then forgets about that, about a third into it, and it starts off with this reporter talking to the camera and telling what happens, and then somewhere towards the middle he shows back up and you forgot that was what the movie was like, and then he disappears again. You never see him again, and it's just the straight story, but it's the same thing. I mean, it's the farm, and it's Ezra Cobb is his character. He's not called Ed Gein, but it's pretty interesting. If you familiar with all that, you should check that one out. You've seen that one, haven't you, Tony?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of why it took, aside from Psycho, which is on a relative scale, it's a very affecting and effective picture, but on a relative scale, it's a pretty mild interpretation of the Gein case. In terms of why it took the movie so long to represent that on screen to the extent that something like a Texas Chainsaw does.
Yeah. Well,
it has everything to do, I think, with the fact that with the aforementioned erosion of the old studio system comes the fall of the production code.
Oh, yeah.
So by the time you get to the 70s, you've already had the period where porno films are playing in art houses and whatnot. That's very much a shift that takes place in the 60s, where there's a lot less lockdown on what can be shown in movies that are expected to have a wide distribution as opposed to just very narrow 42nd Street runs or whatever. So I think that pretty well covers that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Particular element of it.
Yeah, I'm with you there. That makes perfect sense. I'm trying to think through the 60s what horror movies or fantastic movies like that were out, and the Hammer stuff, of course, stands out, but that was still all Gothic until you get to AD 72 or Scars. No, Satanic Rites is what I'm thinking of, what takes place in modern day.
Yeah.
Which combines kind of the Satanism along with the Dracula thing, but takes place in modern building and all this. But before that, I keep going back to Night of the Living Dead, and was it 68? 68 is one of the first ones I can think of that takes that average, ordinary, comfortable setting and turns it into terror or creepy and horror. And I'm getting away from I'm talking horror movie stuff like zombies and Leatherface Killer, and not like actual crime case films.
Yeah.
Like, was it In Cold Blood?
Yeah.
With Bobby Blake and the other guy. Chilling movie.
Yeah.
But it was it's a report, basically a report of an actual event.
Well, and you can make that case about The Town That Dreaded Sundown, of course, right? True crime.
Yeah, true crime. So I'm taking those kind of out of the game here.
Well, where do you? And this is an interesting question, a way to go about it. Where do you draw the line between what's considered horror and what's just a thriller?
Yeah.
You ever read King's Dance Macabre?
No, I have not.
Where he basically analyzes horror fiction in media between the 50s and the start of the 80s. Right?
Oh, okay.
And he comes up. I wish I had the book with me because I've been rereading it lately. But he has a list of 20 films that he considers to be, essentially really scary ones.
Uh-huh.
And all but 4 of the 20 films on his list mostly take place after dark. But on that list are movies like Deliverance.
Oh, yeah.
And Wait Until Dark, which it's Audrey Hepburn and who's Harry Wrote from Scarsdale? Alan Arkin? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's the one where she's blind.
She's blind, right.
Yeah.
Which, terrifying movie, but, do you consider it a horror film? Most people would not.
Yeah.
Most people probably would not consider Deliverance to be a horror film.
But it's a thriller.
But in certainly in terms of like an ordinary pastoral setting, it's a rafting trip that goes awry in a very bad way.
Yeah. There's another film along those lines where these 3 or 4 or 5 businessmen go on a trip like that, and it just shit hits a fan. And I can't remember what it is, and I think Ronnie Cox is in that also. And I shouldn't have even brought it up because that's all I can think of it now. But I had read something a while back, people comparing it or contrasting to Deliverance, and I'll have to look that up because I think that's one of those I put on the list, like, oh, I need to check this out, But yeah, now that's a whole nother discussion right there. What's a horror picture and what's a thriller picture?
Right, and I don't want to take us down that road too far. I'm just saying you do have these elements of, when the fantastic begins to happen to ordinary people under otherwise regular circumstances. Is it fantastic enough to cross that line into something truly horrifying? Whether there's a monster in the movie or just an unsettling human antagonist.
Yeah, well,
right?
I think an unsettling human antagonist where they're something horrible. They have horrible intentions to do something, but the horror doesn't actually happen. Like in Wait Until Dark, nobody gets cut up with a chainsaw, or slashed with a razor beyond recognition.
Fed into a wood chipper.
Yeah, nothing like that happens in that, but it's very suspenseful, and it's you're on the edge of your seat. What's going to happen to her? And these guys are coming after. It's a very good movie. Deliverance. Those guys do some horrible things, but, I mean, I wouldn't call it a horror movie.
Right, but
I call it a thriller, not adventure movie, but,
So where, and I don't know, this is going to sound like a tangent too, but so, you've got somewhere in your mind, there is a line of demarcation between a Deliverance and a Last House on the Left.
Yeah.
Even though bad things happen to people in both films, there's varying levels of revenge. Right.
Yeah.
And only one guy.
There's a whole other topic. We could do an hour or so on just revenge films at some point, which would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's just, in one film, the 2 girls are raped and killed and the parents have to, kill the bad guys.
Yeah.
And the other one, Ned Beatty is raped. Ronnie Cox ends up dead, although he isn't murdered. He's thrown out of the boat? Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. And Bert gets his arm broken, but he's still alive at the end of the movie. So bad things happen, but not to the extent that they do in Last House on the Left. It's just an interesting
Nobody
parallel.
gets disemboweled.
No.
Yeah.
No, there is no horrifying revenge structure in Deliverance like there is in Last House, or there is in I Spit on Your Grave.
Yeah.
Where clearly, I'm not just going to get even. I'm going to get even.
Yeah, body parts don't get cut off in Deliverance. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Once this ball gets rolling with the serene pastoral settings, and I say the golden age of the drive-in and the grindhouse era, I think we've established it's like the early 70s is when it starts going and gets established. After that, it kind of snowballs. Now, do we think it's still budget necessity, or is it? I guess it's probably a little bit of both, though. Is it, hey, Chainsaw made some money, such and such movie made some money. Let's us make one like that. We know once the 80s got here, late 70s, early 80s, after the Halloweens and the Friday the 13th, there was many copycats of those, but in between that, there were a few here and there, like the one that we talked about on podcast just a couple back, or maybe it was the last one, Blood and Lace, which takes place in a halfway house, kind of like an orphanage almost.
Sure.
But it is not supposed to be a horror setting, but it turns out to be. Can you think of any other ones? Any other horror movies like that between like Chainsaw and, say, Halloween and Friday the 13th?
Well, I mentioned The Hills Have Eyes. I think that was 77.
Yeah.
Halloween is 78. After Halloween, I'm not sure. I would defer to the Commodore.
I'm not sure I absorbed the question properly.
Well, we've talked about how once it was established that you can make horror in a innocuous setting, a serene setting, a pastoral, safe. I hate to use the word safe space, but a setting that would not inherently be scary. Once it's established in the early 70s that you can make these places scary.
Yeah.
Do you think that ones that came after that, immediately after that, were of the same way as far as, okay, we got a little bit of budget. We don't have a budget to go anywhere that's inherently creepy or build a set or anything. Can we use Mr. Johnson's barn or the farm down the road? Was it that, or was it, hey, that made money on a farm, let's us make a movie like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the latter, to some extent, seems to make the most sense to me, because you said we don't have the money to, build whatever elaborate set or whatever the case may be. So if you're an independent producer looking to make maximum profit on this horror project you're invested in, that these other pictures made the kind of money you're looking to make without the need for building elaborate sets on sound stages, why would you even be interested in doing that?
Yeah.
I think you have to look to when the majors, in whatever form they were taking at the time, did invest in horror thriller type content. What were they doing? Exorcist, Jaws, Omen. But the vast majority of the horror movies we think of when we think of 1970 stuff was independently produced, right?
Yeah.
From all the things that we've talked about so far, to Carrie, to Halloween, to all those things. What would be your motivation to do anything more elaborate than you needed to with setting?
Yeah.
In that situation.
Yeah. Well, and I think Halloween is probably one of the best examples of making it work.
Yeah.
Because you take a Middletown, America, average neighborhood.
Right.
And you take Halloween night, which is supposed to be kids' night. Go out and get some candy, dress up, have a good time.
Right.
And then it becomes, under the hands of Carpenter, very creepy, very scared, looking over your shoulder. And from then on, that's what you think of it, The first Halloween was just kind of, I guess, like a masterclass in that. At least in my opinion. Anyway.
Well, I'm taking a quick look here, not to jump in, but here are the big movies of 79.
Okay.
I'm not going to give you the whole list. I'm going to give you the ones that you probably, your audience would be most familiar with.
Okay.
Okay. So, following Halloween, the next year, you've got Alien, which is beyond the purview of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
You have the Amityville Horror.
Okay.
Which is a movie about the bad place, right? But again, you don't expect Satanism. Murders took place in that house, like in cold blood.
Yeah, okay.
And then a family buys the house, and more bad things happen, and some of those may be supernatural. You have Cronenberg's The Brood, which is also beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. You've got Badham's Dracula, which is a return to Gothic horror.
Uh-huh.
Phantasm, Coscarelli's Phantasm.
Oh, yeah.
Which is set in a pretty, middle America kind of town, but it clearly veers into territory beyond the scope of our discussion.
Yeah.
Frankenheimer's Prophecy, which is another, man versus nature gone amok. And one of your favorites. I'll skip past it and come back to it.
Okay.
When a Stranger Calls.
Okay. Yeah.
right? Which is,
Just a regular home, and yeah.
and then back up to Tourist Trap.
Yeah.
And that's because I know roadside attractions are near and dear to your heart.
Yes, sir. I love them to death.
And we'll skip Fulci's sequel to Dawn of the Dead, Zombie. Although it
Class
does
by
have
itself.
Zombie versus Shark. But yeah, go back to, all right, so Tourist Trap. Let's work with that, right? Because again, who expects bad things out of a roadside attraction?
And a cheesy,
Unless you've heard bad things about carnies all your life.
Now, that's one that I would like to do a podcast just on that film at some point. I need to see it again. It's been a few years.
Yeah.
But I remember watching it the first time and going, man, why doesn't this have a little more of a following? This is pretty damn creepy.
Mm-hmm.
And but like you say, the roadside attractions, reputation over the years of just being run down and cheesy, and let's stop here with the kids and we'll see the mystery thing or the mystery hole or whatever it is, or the world's largest ball of twine, and then that movie makes you go, maybe we're not going to stop at that now.
Right. Because the consistent underlying thematics of most of these films are, and I was joking about this before, never leave home, right?
Yeah.
You travel someplace different, someplace else, someplace new.
Yeah.
And maybe you're the obnoxious person from the big city who pokes fun at the locals.
Yeah.
The hayseeds, the rubes. Or maybe you just have a bad attitude. Or maybe even though you are a good person, you still run afoul of something that's wrong.
Yeah.
And you become the victim,
Yeah.
right? And there's just this kind of underlying mistrust of the other, right?
Yeah.
I told you we should never have taken that left turn at Albuquerque. Right?
I'm sitting here thinking about this as we're talking, and I begin to realize that horror films, as differentiated from thrillers, the definition of which is somewhat amorphous, but
Sure.
just go with me on that.
Right.
For sake of discussion, we'll say that a thriller is something a little more procedural and a little more real world and a little more concerned with those things than a horror movie would be.
Yeah.
But really all throughout the history of the horror film. So we're talking about, when did it transition from these settings to the pastoral setting? But really there's a common thread that runs all the way through these things from the very beginning, which is the other place, right? So Sam was talking about the fear or mistrust of the other. So if you go back to 30s, you're looking at the universal horrors, which are set in the old world or in some form of the old world transported to the new. Even in the independent, non-universal films like a White Zombie, as the exotic other setting. And you get into the 40s, again, Universal is dominant in a new form. But it's this Never Land, right? It's this sort of out of time pseudo Europe, where you're not quite sure exactly where it's supposed to be or when exactly it's supposed to be. It's a whole other world unto itself. Into the 50s with the atomic age, which is ostensibly tied to its time and place a little closer than the things we've talked about so far, but still exists in its own sort of bubble in some sort of desert suburb. Sort of suburban techno utopia / desert backlog. Or I'm sorry, backlot world that whole milieu exists in, that feels very well placed and very much of its time, particularly in retrospect, probably. Yeah. But still, when you think about it, like no real place in time that ever was. On and on into the Gothic revival of the 60s and now the pastoral settings of the 70s. And the one thing that all of these things have in common is that they are completely removed from the everyday experience of most people, right? So if I'm making a point here, and I'm not sure that I am, I think it might be that this shift into the pastoral setting, the setting in and of itself, is not so far afield from what horror films have always done, right? Really, which is take you out of the familiar and put you somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then circle back to the previous discussion about budgets and locations and the practical circumstances under which these things were made. And here is a something else, another kind of Neverland that the majority of the audience will not be familiar with in a way that would sort of diffuse what we're trying to accomplish here, that we can represent on film, cheaply using natural light and on and on and on. And then again, once that's established as viable, then these things tend to run on trends, and you're going to see it repeated over and over again.
And that's an excellent point. I think the major difference is when you make this last transition, you've brought it very close to home, right? You go to the movies, right, to be scared.
Yeah.
But the chances that once you leave the theater, your belly full of popcorn and soda, right, and you're not going to drive past the creepy medieval castle on the way home, and you're not going to drive through the atomic testing grounds on the way home, probably, unless you live in Nevada or New Mexico. But you may see a broken down car on the side of the road and someone who's flagging you down because they need help. And stopping to help that person is the worst decision you could possibly make, because they turn out to be the psycho killer who's just waiting for someone to be foolish enough to stop and help them. Yeah. And that's the ugly, really reality, I think, of the pastoral horror setting, that the enemy is much closer to us than he or she has ever been before.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think you made that point, or made me think of that point when you brought up the Manson murders in the 60s, because that was a real turning point. And when, like Tony said too earlier about with Vietnam, after you've seen that news footage, I guess the Manson, it does happen about the same time.
About the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
Vietnam was the first televised war.
Yes.
So it was in your living room.
On the 6 o'clock news.
On the 6 o'clock news. And then the Manson incident happened. And there had been other serial killers before that, but this was the first one that was really in your face and publicized on television, and it caught the national attention. And I had the opportunity, I think I was telling you the other night, to talk with an actress who was friends with Sharon Tate and had visited with her the night before that happened. And she had said that it was a complete shift in tone across California and LA the next day. People were looking over their shoulder, looking at each other, hiring bodyguards, getting security systems in their homes, where the night before, it wasn't a thought. So, did that have an effect on films going that way in the familiar settings? Look, like you were saying, the monster next door. What is that guy doing? Because this is different, but in the 40s, when the war started, there was a resurgence in the monster films for escapism.
Well, that, and you could always make the argument that Frankenstein, although in the novel, of course, he's Swiss, Frankenstein sounds German, and that war was fought against Germans, Nazis, right? And by extension, all the classic monsters are classically European, classically Eastern European. So you could make the argument for a subtext of anti-war sentiment in the revival of those particular themes and tropes.
Okay.
I don't think that was consciously, again, I'm ascribing a lot of motive here that it's easy to do in retrospect, right? I think Tony's probably closer to the reality on the truth, that I'm not going to say that, people sat around and said, we should make a movie that basically preys on people's fears of the Manson murders, but with the dissolution of the studio system that he's talked about, and the need to just, we're on a shoestring budget here, let's go out and shoot on location and use available light. What can we do with that? And then you consciously or subconsciously come up with a story that basically uses Manson as a starting point.
Yeah.
Right? It's a combination of things that just happened to click in that place in that time because of what the country is going through, both consciously and unconsciously. So it's lightning in a bottle is what it is.
Yeah.
I have grown over time skeptical, if not cynical, about all of these analyses that suggest or insist upon the socio-political underpinnings of all these genre films, and that cynicism may lead me to sort of overcompensate in the other direction and be a little too dismissive of that sort of thing. I want to establish that. But to your point, the film historian David Scull, in one of the books that he wrote, the name of which escapes me right now, does talk about the fact that he puts forward the notion that it's no mistake that the Frankenstein monster, as portrayed by Karloff in that original film, comes between the First and Second World War, and would surely have triggered in the minds of the audience of that time images of the boys that came back from the Great War in a time where technology was such that you could have parts blown off of you and live, and return to a civilian life as some sort of surgical horror, And he puts forward the notion that the incredible shock that that film had upon its, or shock effect that film had on its audience, might very well be tied to that sort of thing. And I don't want to be too quick to dismiss that idea, because I think there's some merit there, just tying into what you were saying about the Eastern European element.
But it's always easier to make that analysis in hindsight. Like to look back and say, well, the Amityville Horror, for all its supernatural trappings as a successor to The Exorcist and The Omen, is also about double-digit inflation in the Carter years. Because you sink your life savings into this house. It's full of, the walls are bleeding and there's slime coming out and you can't get rid of the flies. And your daughter's talking to this imaginary pig demon. And my God, we're never going to be able to get out from under this thing. The bills, right? And after the fact, you go, well, I suppose there's an argument to be made there. But at the time, no, they were just trying to make a spooky, supernaturally haunted house movie, right? Yeah. Everything else is coincidence. So, even if I sound like I'm buying into my own bullshit, I'm just just trying to put it out on the table.
Just trying to have some fun, folks.
That's right.
Now, go ahead.
I was
not a licensed psychologist. I just play one in a podcast.
I was going to say, you mentioned Halloween earlier, and the Halloween and post-Halloween cycle of horror films, and that's interesting because I was saying before about how the one thing that all these different conventional settings for horror films that you have from the 30s all the way into the middle 70s is that sense of otherworld, except for Haddonfield, which is every town USA.
Yes.
Exactly.
Like Luray.
Wait, we're in Luray. We got to go. Bye. No, go ahead.
And they were never heard from again.
Yeah, so I don't know that I was going on to a further point there necessarily, except to draw that delineation between what I had said earlier and about Halloween in particular.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to a degree, it's the standout ones, like Last House is Everytown, USA. I mean, it's the girl's home on a lonely country road. Now, for the people who have never lived, have lived in suburbia or lived in the city, I guess that is an otherworldly kind of experience, as well as a farm is too. I mean, not so much to me, because I had my mom's parents. My mom grew up on a farm in Carolina, so I had been visiting, since I was a little kid. So I'm familiar with that type of atmosphere.
Right.
I didn't grow up on a farm, but I had been back and forth to one. But I guess people who would never have lived in the cities or whatever have never been to a farm. That is otherworldly. So yeah, I'm following you on that. Yeah, but it's still is a familiar setting to a lot of people though, too. But Haddonfield, I mean, just about everybody has lived in a neighborhood or close to other houses at some point. So that's, the Haddonfield thing is more of a central, I think, type of movie for that type of thing. Now, let's go this direction. Of these types of movies that we're talking about, with a familiar setting, a peaceful setting, serene, not inherently scary, what's your favorite, or one or two of your favorites?
Oh my gosh, I don't know, because over here in the back of my mind, I keep thinking I never got to talk about The Other. Do you remember that TV movie from the very early 70s?
Oh,
twins on a farm, except maybe they're not.
Vaguely,
I think Victor French is in it. I could look it up. Yeah, based on a book.
Yeah.
Creepy. For a TV movie that I saw as a child, creepy as hell.
Yeah.
Saw it again recently on DVD.
Oh.
Still pretty effective.
Yeah.
Yeah. But of the ones we've mentioned, I always had a soft spot for Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
Since I was first introduced to it. Simply because it is so viscerally effective.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to be, I brought this up at a con once. You have, it is relatively bloodless.
Yep.
Yes.
Right?
It is.
Halloween is relatively bloodless. You don't really get the, you don't get Sam Peckinpah territory until you get to Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would have to say go with that one. Yeah. Do I have to go talk about why or just?
Well, if you'd like, you
I'll
can
come back to
elaborate
it.
all you want to.
Let's go around the table. I'll come back to it.
Well, one picture that Sam mentioned when we were tossing this around prior to recording the podcast that has not come up in this conversation thus far is the Wicker Man.
Oh, yeah.
And, to some extent, that's what the Wicker Man is known for, being something that's effectively frightening and suspenseful in this really gorgeous, highly unlikely for a horror film setting. So I think you kind of have to shout out that one, and that's definitely a favorite of mine.
Oh yeah, me too.
That I think fits into the category nicely. But aside from that, sorry if to echo, but Chainsaw. I mean, you just don't beat the Saw, man, and it just works. It works every single time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the fact that it starts with that weird ass music / sound effect and the shots of
it's unsettling,
decomposed bodies and all that. And
it puts you on the edge from the get-go.
It does, but relative to the conversation we're having about unlikely or seemingly unlikely settings for scary things, it feels like a bit of a cheat, when you look at it from that perspective. But it isn't. I mean, it just works.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not much else to say except that it does exactly what it was designed to do in the most effective possible manner.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care who you are.
And it has such a raw, grainy feel. It feels documentary. You've got that narration at the beginning and where Larroquette, it's a true story. And what made it more tragic is that they were so very young.
Yeah.
And you're like, are they going to live? Well, Franklin's not, but nobody cares. Everybody hates Franklin. You want that guy.
People cheered when Franklin got it last time I watched it in the theater.
Yeah. But it is so raw.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And, when you would eventually make your way to the video store and you're like, I'm going to rent this and take it home, right? It sounds terrible, right? Your folks, what are you watching? Chainsaw Massacre? You take that back to Blockbuster right now. Where Last House on, you could slip Last House on the Left in the House. Nobody knew what that was about unless they sat down and watched it with you. You couldn't do that with I Spit on Your Grave.
No.
That's got spit, well, not the spitting with the grave part, right? I don't even know if I have a number 2 on this list. It's just a big gap.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, Chainsaw aside, because I agree completely with both of you. I mean, it's a given. That's a given. That one, it just works and always has and always will. And like I said, I just watched it a month ago with an audience, and it worked. Now it works and there were people in there who had never seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
Along with people who had never seen it in a theater before.
Right.
And I always ask that question when I host movies there at the Narrow, especially the horror movies, who's never seen this, who's never seen it in the theater, trying to get a gauge of what we're looking at audience-wise, and then watch the audience watch the movie.
Right.
That's fun, But Chainsaw aside, I'll have to say, I think Last House on the Left is one of my favorites. And that one gets a weird rap from people. Some people just hate it and think it's just awful. Or it's too realistic, or it's just a snuff film.
Yeah.
And it kind of is in a way, but it's for the same reason you said about Chainsaw. It's got a gritty, almost documentary feel to it. And for me, that's what makes it creepy, because I don't know who I was talking. It may have been Tony at some point, and I don't know. I think if it was you I was talking to, you hit the nail on the head and made me realize it. It has and it may not have been you, but if it was you, it's got a feeling that the way it's shot, everything's kind of close.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you feel like you're holding the camera, or you're in the room with them, just leaning against the wall and not doing anything to stop what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're not able to do anything to stop what's going on, but you're that close with what's going on with them. and following them along and this thing that's going on and this horrible acts that they're doing, that makes it creepy and unsettling.
Yeah.
And the fact that it takes place, two girls going to a concert. Everybody goes to concerts, I mean, from your teenage years to to now to whenever, and then they up in this apartment with people they just met. Well, that's happened. We've all done that. Meet some new friends. Shit hits the fan. They get carried out down this road and right at her own home and in the woods right behind her house.
Yeah.
And that's where it all happens. And the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness and creepiness of that could happen right at your own doorstep.
There are parts of Last House on the Left that obviously not the worst parts, but there are sections of it that you almost feel like could have been cut out and spliced together into one of those 6 or 7 minute films that would have been shown when your parents went to a PTA meeting that makes them come home scared crapless, I'll say, and caution you never, ever, ever, ever talk to strangers except a ride from. I mean, that's how it feels. It feels like the trailer would have been shown at a PTA meeting just to get you to not let your kids leave the house.
Yeah. But what I was getting at with that is that all of that happens in a very normal setting that shouldn't be a scary setting.
Right.
So I think that's, other than Chainsaw, I think that's the one that works the most for me and that I think I appreciate the most for that, what it does with that.
And again, notice that those two come very early in the decade and quite naturally then everything afterward, consciously or not, may feel derivative.
Yeah. And it's another one too where you don't see as much blood as you think you do.
Right.
Wes Craven and Sean Cunningham, who later went on to do, we know Friday the 13th and then, The Nightmare and Hills Have Eyes.
Yeah.
Which was one that I had never seen up until about 2 years ago. I don't know how it slipped through all these years. Effectively creepy.
Yeah. Ordinary people in bad circumstances.
Yeah. I think we about covered. Anything else you want to add or any other films like that we...
No, I mean, we hit a couple, by name only, right? You can search them back down because I mentioned Black Christmas very briefly.
Yeah.
That's, the psycho killer in the sorority house at winter break. Again, you're not really expecting that on a college campus, although it does reinforce the notion, be careful what you do. Well, yeah, but the killer's not supposed to be in the house with us.
Yeah.
Right? That's like when a stranger calls. Well, the calls are coming from upstairs, like the babysitter murders, right? Wasn't Halloween originally supposed to be called the babysitter murders?
I think it was.
Yes. So don't babysit for people. If their children are not the kid from The Omen and the parents are not the killer, the neighbor's a killer.
Yeah.
Just send your children to convents. Unless you don't trust the nuns, they could be the killer.
That's a whole nother nunsploitation. That's a whole nother genre we could talk about at some point. Anything else you want to add on this whole thing, Tony?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about the obvious thematic connection between the latter Nixon years and Watergate in particular, and I Just Remember My Mama.
Oh, here we go.
I'm full of shit. I'm just kidding right now.
I thought you had something good coming up. Oh, who's getting all political on us now?
I thought as soon as I said I Just Remember Mama, you would get the joke, right? But no.
Well, it took a second for it to waft across the room to me there. It's late here out in the woods.
In the dark, no one will hear you. No one will come any closer than town.
Yeah.
No kidding.
In the dark, in the night.
Yeah, in this cabin all alone. I Just Remember Mama. Great trailer, though. Man, well, yeah, I guess we about covered it then. This has been fun. We don't get a chance to do this because, Sam chose to live so far away.
That's right.
And
it's all me.
Conscious decision on his part.
Oh, I didn't choose to live where I live, let me tell you that. It's far too late to ask, let's scare Jessica to death. That was
we can keep going.
Out in the middle no. Out in the middle of nowhere, though, right?
Yeah, that's another one. I think they move or rent a house or something in this middle America town.
Yeah.
And shit starts happening.
Yeah.
Supernatural shit, or is it?
Exactly.
Or is it in her head?
Yeah.
That's another one I need to watch again. I have a copy of that, and I watched it the first time and thought, this is interesting. It's kind of slow, but I've always heard good things about it, So have you seen that, Tony? Let's Scare Jessica to Death. What'd you think about it?
I liked it.
Oh, okay. That's all you got? Okay.
That's all we got.
Well, I'll take you at your word.
I'm just going to note that as we move into the 80s, the protagonists continue to get younger, right? You definitely get into younger 20s and even into teen movies. Because you have teens in Nightmare series, right?
Yeah. When in sleepaway camp, they have actual teens playing teens.
Yes.
Instead of 20 and 30-somethings playing teens.
Yeah. And these things go from being conventions to tropes to tired cliches, by the time you get to the end of the 80s. And the slasher thing has practically run its course.
Yeah.
But again, very early in the 70s and less so as the decade drags on into the 80s, you have quite a bit of effective setting there that it's something new, and it's something, I'll throw this piece of horse crap out there again, right? It directly relates to, in some way, the bearing of a transformation in thinking of national consciousness that our kids have turned against us, right? Well, because of the generation gap, right? Moving out of the what did you call it? The hippie hangover? The summer of love. That's great.
I like that a lot.
Right. That, all right, well, then, you just move out on your own and don't speak to your mother and I anymore. We'll see what becomes of you. And the next thing you know, they're, dead in a ditch. Oh, wow, the 70s.
You don't like kids, do you?
No,
And you, another thing, you damn kids.
Get off my lawn.
Well, all I'll say is this is beyond the scope of the discussion as we wrap things up, but Rob Zombie's tribute to this kind of thing, House of a Thousand Corpses, is what you've got, dumbass, as Sid Haig so charmingly says, dumbass kids got themselves turned around and got lost, right? And Captain Spaulding didn't like kids either. But it's the exact same thing, and it's a perfect homage to the exact type of film we're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's another one, roadside attraction, cheesy roadside attraction, and then...
Tourist Trap.
Yep.
Funhouse.
I love Funhouse. Oh, man, that's one of my favorite 80s. I don't know if you really even call that a slasher movie. That's just a horror movie.
Yeah, it's just horror.
Yeah. But it does take place in the most unlikely of places.
Yeah.
Who would ever suspect carnies or circus folk?
Well...
unless you've seen Scooby-Doo.
That would be another good one. Carny movies or traveling carnival movies, because there's a few of them out there.
Yeah. And you could start with Freaks if you really want to.
Oh yeah, and definitely going.
You kind of have to.
Yeah, well, that's the benchmark. The first one.
That is true. Use real circus freaks in your movie.
Man, that movie, infamous.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get them to show that in the Narrow.
And worth its reputation. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh man, we're gonna get in talking about freaks and going.
No.
I'm sure anybody that's still left listening is ready to stop at this point.
Well, if I'm going to talk about my freaks, I'm going to have to talk about my peaks. That's all I'm saying.
Well, that's a good a note as any to end on.
That is.
And once again, like I was saying, this has been cool because we don't get a chance to get together very often, hardly ever, every couple of years maybe. And this was cool. I know we've talked all weekend about all kinds of different stuff, but now we got something recorded for posterity. It was fun for me and interesting, so I hope it was for anybody that's listening.
Entertaining over here.
Indeed.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. That's it, and good night.